Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you, and later on this evening, I'm really looking forward to it. According to the organizers, I'm here to discuss driving product excellence through innovation, and that's what I'll try to do. But first of all, I will make the absolute statement, and it's probably not necessary for the people in this room, but it's a lesson that is somewhat lost on large established American enterprises with a unique financial focus where all of the targets of the company, all of the goals, the whole culture is built around the achievement of financially defined targets. So if your overriding business strategy, if somebody's were to have said to Ford Motor Company or GM or Chrysler, what is your business strategy and what is your purpose? All of those companies would have answered to maximize profits, return on investment, increase shareholder value, and become one of the most valued corporations in America. And nowhere in that description would you have found to provide superior products to the consumers that they will want to buy, will enjoy driving, and will want to buy again. That just wasn't part of the agenda. So if the American automobile business came very close to disappearing because it was driven by people who I'm frequently accused of not liking Harvard Business School, which is probably a bad view to have in view of Professor Christensen's presence here today. And I have to admit to having an MBA myself. I got one like sailors get tattoos before I knew any better. But the systematized, what the problem with business degrees and the way business education is run in the United States is everything is measurable, everything is subject to metrics. If you can't measure it financially, it doesn't exist. And therefore, we will not make investments into corporate image, corporate reputation, customer delight, customer response to a new design, because all of these things are immeasurable. And the finance person will ask you, well, if we do that, how many more units will we sell, and how much additional aggregate profit will we make? And of course, these are impossible questions to answer. The only thing you know is if you do not invest in these intangibles, sooner or later you're going to be out of business. And my problem was always that a short-term profit maximization process, which almost invariably involves cost reduction, and there's this intense focus on cost. How many of you in this room have MBAs? Okay, you will remember taking case studies in your MBA course. And there was always a description of some horrible business situation where the company is losing market share, losing profitability. And your job as an MBA student was to read through this case and read through reams of data and tables. And by doing a good analytical job, you could find out what the company was doing wrong. And it was usually something like, our credit terms are too onerous and other companies are accepting higher credit losses, but they're making it up in added sales, or we have too much capacity, or our product assortment is too great. We've got to follow the 80-20 rule and focus on the 20% of the products that generate 80% of the revenue. But there was always some magic silver bullet in there, which if you found it, you were the winner in that particular case. I never saw one case study in any business education facility I've ever had to do with where the answer to the question is, our product isn't good enough. Or our design is lousy. That was never because those things are not measurable and they can't be defined in a business case. And yet, and that's what I think is so terribly wrong. I don't think there are I hope there are, but I don't think there are business schools today that have courses in innovation, leading edge design, anticipating customer desires and needs and responding to them that's the real driver of the business. Then what the controllers and bean counters do to make sure, package order around it and make sure that people adhere to their budgets. Of course, all of that is necessary, but that's not the driver of the business. If you don't have customer delight and customer satisfaction and product excellence front and center, you're just not going to succeed, and I don't care how good your finance department is and how good they are at generating a cost minimization model. I've got an example or two here of innovation gone wrong, because here's the other thing that happens in large corporations. General Motors at one point had a number of consultants and dealers and customer feedback saying, your cars aren't bad, but they're boring. This was sort of in the late 90s. So management sat together and said, we'll fix this. We will institute a process that drives innovation. And the way we'll do that is we'll tell product planning, from now on, 40% of all General Motors products must be innovative. Well, right, it's innovation by decree. It was the silliest thing I'd ever heard. So product planning started serving up truly wacky stuff, which was innovative, but was in no way customer-oriented or focused on excellence. And one of which I describe in the book, Car Guys versus Bean Counters. And it's, by the way, that whole book describes kind of my lifelong battle in large corporations. And by the way, one of the reasons I served first 9 years at GM, then 3 years at BMW in Munich, then 13 years at Ford, and then 13 years at Chrysler, and then finally at age 70, I was rehired by General Motors for a second stint. One of the reasons for this, you would say, colorful career of many stations is that I was always kind of pushing the boundaries of what a large corporation would accept. I'll talk more about that later. And you do at some point wear out your welcome. I was never actually fired. I was just always short of getting fired, but it was, I almost always got to the point where I recognized that I had outlived my usefulness for that particular corporation. But the other thing, and I blame some of the consultants of the late 80s and 90s, all the consultants that were peddling the total quality excellence model. You all remember that? I mean, every consulting company in the United States was going around and telling American companies, we can outdo the Japanese in quality. We can change your culture to one of quality orientation. And they charge, tens of millions of dollars for it. And basically what they did is they took the very legitimate success of invariable process focus out of manufacturing. And that was the genius of the Toyota production system. And Eiji Toyota actually invented it, was creating a production system with just in time, no waste, no inventory on the line, creating manufacturing processes that were error-proof so that a part could not be misinstalled, or you couldn't replace one part with another. And they had all these very ingenious systems for ensuring quality. But one of the principles was operator training, so that every station, the operators on both shifts invariably performed the operation exactly the same way. No innovation allowed, no picking up two parts at once because it's easier, no devising a better way to get the nut started on the bolt. Everybody had to do it invariably the same way. And that discipline, I will tell you, works. It's since been adopted by every automobile company in the world and every supplier and probably every large manufacturing company follows exactly the same principles, which is why we now get bulletproof quality on almost everything we buy, regardless of national origin and regardless of category. The only exception, of course, being electronic devices, which still, unlike automobiles, crash twice a day. And what the problem with process is, where the consultants made the mistake is they thought that they could take, if it worked for manufacturing, why doesn't it work for the whole corporation? So the rigors of process-directed thinking were imposed on those parts of the organization, like design and engineering and manufacturing and research, where a process focus is really the enemy of innovation. If you set about designing and engineering a car generation after generation with no change in method, you're probably eliminating risk of an error, but you're also absolutely setting the scene for your own failure, because you will no longer have continuous improvement, let alone discontinuous leaps in improvement. Some of these forced innovation designs, one of them is, I know that people from New York don't know a lot about automobiles, but I'm sure most of you, certainly those of you in the design community, know what a Pontiac Aztek is. Right. That was one of the products of forced innovation. Nobody liked it, but everybody said, well, it's innovative, and it's the sort of thing that we should do. Clearly, innovation that is not an improvement. And by the way, what John Hockenberry talked about the Apple Watch. I'll tell you, as far as I'm concerned, we shall see. I thought the iPod was a terrific innovation that brought new value. The iPhone was, the iPad was, but a watch with all those functions, I'm just not sure. We'll see what happens, but I don't see the compelling newness and the compelling addition of customer value when all of us have a handheld device that takes pictures, sends and receives email, is a telephone, gives us the weather, takes movies, stores movies. We have that device. But in addition to that device, at the flick of a sleeve, we can see the time. And I think there's a separation of systems and a separation of functions, which to me makes a whole lot of sense. And I really don't see people even half my age putting on their reading glasses to check their watch for emails. But we'll see. I mean, nobody has 100% batting average, and it would be interesting if Steve Jobs were still around, whether the Apple Watch would have happened or not. At any rate, one of the when I got to GM, I was the guys told me that I had better go over and check what was being done for Buick. So I went over and looked, and here was a mock-up of a car with a steering wheel and no instrument panel. And I said, where's the instrument panel? And they said, that's the innovation. It will be a car with no instrument panel. And I said, well, why are we doing this? I mean, where's the customer value? Glad you asked. Buick is a brand for the elderly. And by the way, back then we accepted that. And GM has since been able to reverse that with a new product strategy, which has lowered the average owner age of Buick by about 30 years, and that's not including China, where the average age of Buick owners is around 30. But at any rate, when I got there in 2001, the accepted wisdom was that the Buick brand will go away when the last customer dies, but meanwhile we're going to make it easier for them. So they said elderly people are frequently confused by the instruments and all those switches. So what we're doing is we're taking all that away from them and giving them a featureless, non-instrumented appearance. And I said, well, how do they control the car? Well, it's all voice input. And I said, is this going to work? Yeah. And by the way, we tested it with a focus group. We had a bunch of people over 65, and we showed them a movie. And in the movie, it showed the driver saying windshield wipers, and the windshield wipers came on, and then it showed the driver saying left turn, and the car said left turn and worked the turn indicator. And this, by the way, the speed of the car was shown in a heads-up display projected in the windshield, so they did know how fast they were going. And how did the focus group respond? Well, in the focus group, when you're showing people a video of how things work ideally, invariably people are going to like it. So they'd like an 80% success rate in the video. I then went to drive. I said, do we have any hardware? Oh, yeah, we've got a couple of experimental cars. And meanwhile, my people in engineering said, look, Bob, we've been working on this stupid thing for 2 years. We're devoting untold engineering resources to it. It's going to cost $850 per car, and this is in an environment where somebody who proposes something that costs 85 cents has his sanity questioned. But $850, and they said, we don't think it's very good. And I said, well, why doesn't somebody kill it? Well, nobody thinks they have the authority to kill it. Everybody is sort of hoping that a group consensus will emerge that this isn't very good. I went to drive the car at Milford Proving Ground, and which is a rural village about 50 miles northwest of Detroit. We took it off the proving ground and drove it through the village of Milford. And I tried to control this thing, and I luckily had an engineer with me. And it took such an intensive mental focus to try to think of what you're going to tell the car to do next, because he said, tell it something. And I said, colder. And he said, no, you can't do that. You first have to say climate control. And I said, okay, climate control. And the car repeated climate control. And then I said, colder. And he said, no, you have to say temperature. And so you had to verbally scroll through a menu to do what normally you would reach out and you would twist a knob 20 degrees. And I went like through 2 or 3 red lights, intensely focused on what I was doing with the car. And I finally looked at the engineer and said, let's take it back. This isn't going to work. And he said, I agree with you, but we've been told to keep working on it. So I gathered everybody together. And I said, I have news for all of you. I think as head of product development, I am empowered to make this decision. Silent Servant, or Quiet Servant as it was called, is dead as of right now. We're going to spend the $850 on other things that the consumer will like a lot better than this system. And some of the Buick marketing people thought it was the end of the world. And frankly, the Buick brand was the better for it, because there are better ways to spend $850 on a car than that stupid thing. And by the way, I think in terms of wrong-headed innovation in cars, and I would say almost excessive use of electronics in automobiles now, where the chip enables capability that may be beyond what the customer actually needs or wants, where electronics make perfect sense in an automobile, and a lot of computing power is devoted to this, obviously, is the whole management of the combustion process, the ignition process, the right timing of events in the engine, and it is the computing technology in those areas that has enabled the modern car to get the holy trinity of fuel economy, performance, and emissions compliance all in one. I mean, 20 years ago, honestly, in the industry, with using relatively primitive at that time electrical and electromechanical means, we didn't think we would ever be able to see something like a new Corvette Z06, which meets the most stringent emission requirements in the world, has 650 horsepower, and gets 25 miles per gallon on the highway. It was just, come on, you're dreaming. This is not, but with modern electronics, that's possible. It's also another brilliant application is in so-called stability control systems, where you have all kinds of sensors in the car that sense an incipient skid or loss of control, and immediately, faster than any human driver can react, the car itself initiates corrective action with differential braking and conking the steering, removing throttle if necessary, and gets the car back on track. These are, to me, are sensible and intelligent applications of electronics. Then you got the medium category. I'm now driving two cars which are semi-autonomous in the sense that they have lane departure warning and so-called adaptive cruise control. Adaptive cruise control is radar-based. And so once you say, set up your speed for 75 miles an hour, it'll hold 75 miles an hour unless you approach another car, at which point your car will slow down. It will, in fact, even slow down to a stop if the person in front of you stops. And you can adjust the gap on the freeway to be closer or farther away. The problem with adaptive cruise is that even at the minimum distance, because of the thinking of the product liability lawyers and those who defend against them, the minimum distance on the freeway is so great that in relatively heavy traffic, people from the right lane are constantly cutting in front of you because you have such a big gap to the guy in front of you. And when they do cut in front of you, the radar senses it and backs you off and creates a new big gap. So you wind up being a charitable institution. You're in the left lane and you're constantly letting everybody from the right get in. And I obviously am still in close touch with the engineers at GM, and they said, yeah, well, that's just the way it is. If you don't like that, you have to override it manually. Well, that to me kind of defeats the whole purpose of the thing. The other area where I think the industry has gotten carried away is with the driver vehicle interface. Some things are very hard to improve on, and one of them is climate controls, which the traditional system that's been around for 30 or 40 years is one knob that's labeled red and blue, which basically controls your temperature, or it can actually be marked in centigrade or Fahrenheit, but at any rate, that's one controls your temperature. Then there's one that you turn that has little symbols of where you want the air to come out. And then the third one is the blower control, which says 1, 2, 3, 4, and has a picture of a fan on it. Those are all really easy to work. And all you have to do is reach out, grab one, and twist it. And then you can have, obviously, improvements on that, where you can have a button where you can digitally control the desired temperature, and the car will hold that temperature and so forth. That's all good stuff. But where it gets crazy is when you have a touch screen and you look and there's no climate control knobs. And this is one of the prime reasons why the Ford Motor Company went from being near the top in the annual J.D. Power Quality Survey, near the top, and they, within 2 years, were like third from the bottom and stayed there because the customers hated that system. It was called My Ford. In Ford's, it was called My Ford, and in Lincoln's, it was called My Lincoln. And people the average person who is not a computer scientist, the average Lincoln or Ford owner, or I would say Cadillac owner, because Cadillac has a version of this as well, is not a 22-year-old tech geek, but is in fact a somewhat comfortable, probably 55-year-old successful man or woman who is used to operating controls in a certain way. And then when you now force them to scroll through screens, in the case of the Cadillac, you reach out your hand. This is, interesting technology. You sort of make a gesture towards the screen, and the home page comes up, and then you can select climate control, and then once you've got climate control, you've got your other controls depicted on where the air comes out and whether you want the heat up or down. But the point is, it requires multiple actions and multiple movements, and it's not intuitive, and it may be cool, but it is not practical, and to me that falls in the category of innovation that we really don't need. I will just say that I've always been a proponent. I'm going to stop here any second now so that we can have a little Q&A, but I've been a proponent of the so-called says who philosophy of business, and it's especially useful in large corporations. And I always try to, I think large corporations tend to draw people who are conformists. And if they weren't conformists, they probably wouldn't join a large corporation. And large corporations also like conformity because they can't deal with too many people like me all at once. But if you don't have, in any large organization, I don't care whether it's a hospital, a university, the military, or a large corporation, if you don't have people who actively challenge the status quo and say, says who, when somebody says, well, here's how we do this. And if it seems stupid to you, I always encourage people, if something the company is doing routinely seems dumb to you, and if you're told that this is the way to do it, you should say, says who. And then usually you'll find that the who doesn't exist. It's just something that evolved, or the who was such a long time ago that nobody remembers. I always said, don't be afraid of new ideas. Be afraid of the old ideas, because the old ideas are the ones that will kill you. I think corporate America is plagued by groupthink. A lot of times nobody wants to be the first to disagree. Nobody wants to rock the boat. And I always challenge people to please be one of the people, be one of the disruptive people who are sometimes hard to tolerate inside a corporation because they waste time in meetings and they argue a lot. But if you don't listen to them, you're gonna be in big trouble as a corporation. So I think the real key to driving, if you're in a senior leadership position, the key to driving innovation is to create an environment of true innovation that encourages innovation, as Mr. Porcini said, not an environment where the first person who steps out and tries something new and fails at the new effort is immediately publicly punished, pilloried, demoted, or even fired. If you do that, you'll never see anybody step forward with anything new again. It's the late, great Steve Jobs once said, before he was tossed out of Apple for being too right-brained, too creative, and finally had to be begged to come back to save the company, he said, innovation has nothing to do with how many R&D dollars you have. When Apple came up with the Mac, IBM was spending at least 100 times more on research and development. It's not about money. It's about the people you have, how you're led, and how much they get it. And nobody could ever say today that Apple doesn't get it. So fostering a creative environment free of excessive shackles of the bean counters leads to innovation. And innovation, if it's the right kind of innovation that actually adds customer value, it leads to great products, which in turn lead to great products. And great products and brands lead to exceptionally good products and increased shareholder value. But that as I always tried to point out, especially my last 10 years at General Motors. That's the way it works, folks. First comes the innovation, then come the great products that create customer value, which results in added sales and higher transaction prices. And that is what generates the profit and the return on investment and the shareholder value. And that's the way you've got to look at it. It starts with innovation and product excellence and ends in shareholder value. And it isn't the other way around. Because I lived 40 years of my life in large corporations, seeing the management and the finance department and treasury start out with, in 5 years, we want our stock to be at $80 per share. $80 per share means this much annual profit on sales of this many. And the way to get there is they'd work backwards, and they would define the future product and its content by whatever it took cost-wise to get to that $80 per share in 5 years. And of course, I've been around long enough to realize that with that philosophy, the $80 per share never happened. Never, ever. In fact, it went the other way. So that's the end of my semi-prepared remarks. And if we have any time left over, I'll be happy to take a question or two.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Bob. Thank you also, Walter, for that great introduction and just one of the examples of the legends that are here today. I want to remind you a couple of things before we have our break at 10:45. That the American Productivity and Quality Center, the APQC, which is a leading proponent of business benchmarking, test practices, and knowledge management research, and an Edison Award partner, and we want to thank all the partners here today, attendees will receive an email with an offer of a report that identifies potential performance gaps in getting high-quality products and services to market. Your report, which will be tailored to your organization and has a retail value of $5,000, will be offered at no cost to today's attendees. And perhaps it will have that sequence of how process works according to the way Bob defines it if you get that email. So I just want to remind people that's just one of the things that's going on here today, and I'll have a few more of those a little bit later. So how do you think the auto industry is doing as an innovation leader in terms of transforming society or contributing to changes that are taking place in cities and communities around the world?
Yeah, thanks very much for that question, John, because I was debating whether or not I should put the future of the automobile industry in my basic remarks or rely on somebody to ask the question. I don't think any automobile company at this point truly grasps what's going on. And what's going on is with the increased congestion in all of the world's major cities, we are rapidly approaching the phase of total gridlock, at which point the automobile will provide no value to anyone if we can't use it to get around with. The people are also forgetting the whole issue of human fallibility, in that they always said pilots will never be replaced by computers because the human being is the most complex, easily programmable, nonlinear servo mechanism yet devised, and it is cheaply and easily reproduced by unskilled labor. And
Edison did not say that. Edison, yeah.
No, but military pilots say it.
Yeah, right.
And it was true up until a short time ago, but now I think we're entering the phase where the failure rate of human beings is higher than the failure rate of machines. And I think the automobile industry gets it, but the vision is only 2 to 3 years out. For instance, if you take adaptive radar cruise, add to it a couple of visibility systems like forward-looking infrared and video, and you take your lane departure systems to where now they nudge you if you depart from the lane. That can be inputted to the steering to where the steering will correct automatically. And I have news, every car company, every week somebody announces that In another 2 years, we'll have cars that will drive autonomously on the freeway. And it's true, and everybody will, because everybody is at the same stage of development. Why? Because everybody is using the same suppliers for the hardware. So whether Tesla makes an announcement or Cadillac makes an announcement, Mercedes-Benz makes an announcement, or Infiniti, it's all going to be the same systems integrated in the same way. And on the freeway, with a combination of GPS, synthetic vision, radar distance warning, lane departure sensing, you will be able to drive along from, say, New York to Chicago on the freeway fully autonomously. Secondary roads, different issue. So right now, the automobile industry sees this as the future, but I'll tell you that's not the future. The real future is the blending of mass transportation with individual transportation. And I mean, the time frame for this may be 20 or 30 years, and it's going to require massive investments in infrastructure. But here's how it's going to work. The automobile will be replaced by electrically powered, normed, that is, modules that are conform to certain dimensions and certain touch points and certain levels of interactivity with other modules so that they can be used individually or linked into a train. So what you will do is you will call for a module at your house. It arrives, and it's battery powered by advanced batteries and probably has a 200-mile range. But the range of the module doesn't really matter because all it has to do is get to the freeway, which will, once you've programmed in your final destination, you can sit back and relax. This thing will take you to the freeway, and it's barcoded. You know, as you enter the freeway, your account will be debited. And then you go into an acceleration lane, and your module will be accelerated by inductive cables buried in the concrete. And it'll go from a slow acceleration lane to a faster one with more and more power. It will no longer operate on its own batteries. It will now get the power from the inductive cable. And finally, it reaches the 120 or 150 mile an hour lane, and the traffic flow will open up just enough to permit your module to slide in. You don't have to do a thing. And then the distance between modules could be inches, could be a couple of feet. It doesn't matter. The whole thing is now like one continuous train moving at very high speeds. As you approach your destination, your module knows what its exit point is. It'll separate from the flow and go into decel lanes. And then finally, the barcode will be sensed at the exit because so that the system knows how many freeway miles you used up. And then the module will be automatically back on its own power, and it will take you to your final destination, at which point you get out and you basically send it away. So this is the small size, the flexibility, the adaptability, the ability to blend into larger streams moving at very high speeds. That to me is the future of individual transportation. This future is clearly not popular with the automobile industry because what happens to brands? What happens to the BMW oval? What happens to the Mercedes grill? What happens to mine's bigger or mine's more expensive if all of these modules are the same size and the same shape? So it's not a pleasant future, but I really see and I almost hate, as a car guy, I hate myself for saying this. The automobile, as we know it today, individually owned, individually driven, individually garaged, individually maintained, is going to go exactly the same way as the horse went at the beginning of the 20th century, where the horse stopped being a means of locomotion for mass transportation or individual transportation, goods transportation in inner cities, and the horse was replaced by the internal combustion engine. So what happened to the horse? The horse obviously didn't disappear. The equine industry today is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Horses are living comfortably and well-tended on dude ranches, horse farms, riding stables all over the country. So the horses survived, and already we're seeing automotive country clubs because if you own a Ferrari, Lamborghini, or a Corvette Z06, there's really no way to legally explore the potential of the car on public highways. So there's one in upstate New York in Monticello, which is 2 racetracks, and you can buy a membership in this club. You can take your car.
That's the Mine's Bigger Club?
Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, right. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, mine's faster.
Mine's Faster
Yeah.
Club. Mine's Faster Club. Yeah.
So I think the automobile as we know it today will become a cottage industry. Rare cars will continue to be bought and sold, but the cars driven by individuals on public highways are going to be a thing of the past. And I think nobody really truly grasps that vision yet, because it's in a way for the automobile industry, building normed modules that are not brandable is equivalent to
Yeah, well, you can
a sad ending to an industry that is. One of the things I liked about Mr. Porcini's comments is he talked about the emotional content of brands. I didn't know that Pepsi-Cola had much emotional content, but I'm sure it has, and it's measurable.
Sure.
But
Alex
I will
Rodriguez
tell you-
already called me about those Gatorade individual pouches. He wants to know if they're legal.
But I will
Apparently they
tell
are.
you,
Yeah.
automobiles, brand awareness, brand recognition, and the internal belief that people have about certain brands is the dominant factor.
Well, let me
in
ask
the
you one
automobile
last
industry.
question
Yes,
before
sir.
we break for networking, and we'll get right on time here. And again, referring to Mr. Porcini's remarks, you'll notice that he may get his produce from Fresh Direct, but if you look carefully at his shoes do not come from Fresh Direct. And leave it to an Italian designer to tell us that basically the difference between design and innovation in the World War II era and the 3D printing era is that you move creating design from the garage to the bedroom. Only an Italian designer can say that, and they're absolutely right, that's for sure. So with that in mind, how much would you say Tiger Woods' shenanigans contributed to the emotional change in the Buick brand? Because you talked about Buick. You brought up Buick.
I think we had Tiger Woods at a time when Buick still believed that traditional sporting figures and the fact that Tiger Woods was a double minority in being African American and Asian, he was seen as a threefer. Because
Well, it didn't work for Tiger, but it worked for Buick.
I don't think it worked for Buick.
Really?
No, I really don't. I think celebrity advertising rarely works for anybody, especially not in automobiles, because unlike branded products like toothpaste and soft drinks, automobiles require a fairly significant investment. The other thing about automobiles is everybody else sees what you drive. And the reason you don't see so much design change in refrigerators and washing machines is that once you have them, they remain in the quiet hallowed halls of your kitchen, and nobody sees that you've got a 20-year-old refrigerator. And as long as it still works, it's fine. But try driving a 20 or 25-year-old car around, unless it's a prestigious make, and your friends will say, "Hey, don't you think it's time to get a new car? I mean, that old thing of yours." The thing that drives so much of car marketing and Mr. Porcini related to it is the car more than anything else becomes your exoskeleton. It is what you would like to be and the way you would like others to see you. and people select their car brands on that basis. And I think celebrity advertising just runs counter to that. And besides, back in those days, Buick had Tiger Woods, but it didn't have the products that it has today.
Right, right. Bob Lutz, thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
And